Hi, y'all. I'm Lauren Golembiewski, CEO and co-founder of Voxable, and we build conversational interfaces for other companies and products. So that includes chatbots and Alexa skills and actions on Google for the Google Assistant. Anything where human is talking to a machine. My background is in design and user experience. So I'm going to talk about some of the elements of conversational interface design today. Okay, cool. So we're gonna start with the core technology, and this is like the full human-machine interaction loop, and these are kind of the basic pieces that some of them you don't necessarily need. As Ben mentioned, we don't necessarily need natural language understanding, but these are the pieces that we typically build into our bots and that you kind of need to have in place to kind of complete that loop. So we're gonna dive into each one of these. And first is like the human needs to actually interface with that machine. And the way that they do that is through like an interaction channel. That is like my term, not official, but on like text-based interfaces, like a chatbot, that would be the actual messaging channel that you're interacting with. SMS, Slack, Cisco Spark, Skype, Kik, Facebook Messenger, amongst many others. These are all platforms that you can interact with a bot on and build bots in. If you're building a voice interface, you're most likely going to be building it on a piece of, or for a piece of hardware like the Amazon Alexa or the Google Home, and that hardware has a microphone in it and it's listening for you. And when it listens for you, it takes human speech. So usually you have to use a wake word. After you use that wake word, like, hey, Alexa, it's gonna take human speech and try to translate it into just text. And automatic speech recognition is the technology that does that. So we can see like, here is a messaging channel interface elements. This is just kind of like grabbing some of them from Facebook Messenger. So on, if you're using Facebook Messenger as a user, here are all of the elements that users can interact with. They can interact with text, there's buttons, there's galleries, images, and all different types of structures for the messages that you can send. And this is probably one of the most robust. And then here is an example of automatic speech recognition in action. If you're using like the Alexa, you might say, hey, Alexa, and she's listening for you. And she has like little indicators that she's listening. This one's a little bit better because it's Google Voice Search and you can actually see like the ASR happening. So it's actually kind of updating as I speak to it and like updating what it thinks I'm saying based on the other words around that it's hearing around the things I'm saying. Cool, so now that you have text that the machine has either extracted or the user has input through a text box, you need to give that text some structure. And usually the way that we do that is through natural language understanding. And really natural language understanding, or NLU models, are taking text and turning it and giving it some meaning and turning it into structured data so that like a system can go and use it and perform an action. And like typically we are, like there's many ways to build NLU. People like build it from scratch. Our favorite way is to use one of the many platforms out there like API.ai, Microsoft Lewis, IBM Watson, all have NLU platforms that you can go in and build your model using their technology. So now you have like your text has some meaning. You maybe pulled out some data from that text, and we call this like stop on the interaction loop bot intelligence. And bot intelligence is really what's like composing responses. Or carrying out actions. And it's also managing like a bunch of different states. So it's managing the state of the system, the state of the user, the state of the conversation. So if you're thinking about user state, maybe it's the user's very first time interacting with your bot and they need help or they need a little bit of education. So maybe you respond differently to a user on their first time versus like their 10th time. The conversation state, are you asking the user for like a affirmative or a negative? And if they say yes or no, what is that actually referencing? And then the state of the system is like, what happens when your server is down and it can't actually perform an action? What happens? What instructions do you give the user when there are errors? So then like the final feedback loop is once that result is generated and the action is carried out, you need to give information back to the user. So you need to complete that loop. And on a messaging app, you'll get a text message back, you'll get an image back, you'll get any one of those elements that I showed you. A user can receive that back as the response. In voice interfaces, it's speech, and the machine needs to speak it back to you. Typically, that's done with synthesized speech. So there's actual like models and neural networks that are built to synthesize speech. There's a bunch of really cool products out there and technology that's advancing super fast. On the Google Home and Alexa, you're beholden to the options that they give you. But IBM Watson has a bunch of synthesized voices that are really cool. Google is doing a lot of research on this. Their DeepMind research team released a paper called WaveNet that gets speech synthesis closer and closer to real human speech. And then there's this really freaky one called Lyrebird, like the animal lyrebird, and it can mimic any voice with like 1 minute of training data, and it is super freaky. Like, go check it out. I should have just showed you here, but they have Donald Trump voice, they have Barack Obama voice, they have Hillary Clinton voice, and they have them all talking together. You can tell that it's machine, but it's still freaky and it's going to get better. And thankfully, they say they're gonna open source that. So maybe we'll be able to control the voice crimes in the future. So now that we talked about like that underlying technology and how to what the feedback loop is actually made of, we're going to talk a little bit about some UX principles in conversational interfaces. And these are like high level. Every single product and brand is going to have its own users, its own situations that you should probably test and do like good usability practices for. But here are some things that we kind of work with to get us started on building a user experience. Developing a clear brand. And let me just dive in because I'll go over them in detail. Developing a clear brand, like any product you build, needs to have a good brand foundation. Users want to know who you are and what you do and why you're doing it in order to build relationships with products, people, anything. And I think in conversational interfaces, it's especially important because it's a much more intimate interaction that we're having with people. And we're trying to get to that point where there is artificial intelligence, whatever that means. But in order to get there, people need to believe what that product's doing. And if you develop a good brand, people will forgive your mistakes a lot more. So you get a pass on a lot of things. We're in the midst of writing a series of blog posts about branding bots. I'm gonna dive into some specifics of branding a little bit later, but you can check that out either through that bit.ly link or go to our website. So once you've established a good brand, you kind of need to figure out, hopefully you've generally figured out what your bot is doing. These aren't really linear, but you need to figure out what your bot is gonna do, all the things it's gonna provide the user. And we like to use the jobs to be done framework in order to frame this as we're building out the things that bots are doing. And the reason I really like jobs, and if you don't know what jobs to be done is, it kind of frames product marketing and discovery as a job that your users are hiring your product to do. And the reason we really like jobs to be done is because, first of all, jobs as a concept is a really good, is very relatable to an intent as a concept, and intents are pieces of natural language understanding models that define user goals. It also really helps you focus on what your product or bot is doing. And we believe that the best chatbots are ones that have a very clear focus. And so using jobs to be done just helps you focus on my bot. Users are hiring my bot to do a job. Let me help them get that done. And then maybe we'll delight them after that, or maybe it will be delightful in the process. So Intercom wrote a really great book that's a primer on jobs to be done. So if anyone wants to check that out, I think that's a really valuable resource. Okay, so we figured out what your bot is gonna do, what job it's fulfilling for users, and now you need to start building out that conversation. And we do this in a series of like diagrams, really like how the conversation is going to flow. How might a user ask for that? And then what do we say after to help them accomplish that goal and to get that job done? What might a user just prompt, like say immediately? And then how do we guide them to accomplishing that job? And so here's like an example of a bot whose job is to book a flight or search for flights. And so like this is just a quick one of many branching flows that will happen in this bot. Someone just says, show me flights, and they have a departure city, they provided us that, a time and a day, and then we ask them some more questions because we want to help them filter, because that's what our bot has decided is the best way to accomplish that job. Or I guess we as designers decided that for the bot. So then you model all those conversations, and we need to make sure that those conversations are readable or understandable by the machine. So we're starting with very human interactions, and we're gonna take that down into, okay, well, how does a machine understand what the user is actually saying? And again, here's the intent flight search, and this is what our natural language understanding model is going to be trained to look out for. And within this utterance, and so utterance is just like a thing a user can say, within the utterances is data, and we're pulling out the data that says departure city, destination city, date, and time. And all of this data is important to run a successful flight search. And so searching for a flight is the intent, is one of the goals or jobs that our bot is accomplishing. And this is how we make sure that the natural language understanding model and the business logic understands how to carry that out and what the important pieces are. So that's kind of like the zoomed in. You're working with the individual words and the data. And we always like to like zoom out after you get a lot of it built. And really you need to like start to think about the overall structure of your bot and the high level kind of pathways and mental models that your user is creating. And so there's a disconnect between like how the system is working, how that system is represented to the user, and then how the user understands it in their own head. And understanding like the disconnect between those things is really going to help a designer manage the conversation and manage where a user might want to go from any given stopping point and what their assumptions are when they get there. So it's understanding like the way your implementation model is really great. I, as a designer, like leave that up to the developers. The representation model is the actual piece that I'm working on. And then the mental model is like what a user's concept of what the system does is. And so obviously all your users are gonna have slightly different their mental models are gonna be different, but you think about that and the variances and the kind of average, and you start to build out a conversation that can help users understand what exactly is going on. So those are kind of the high level user experience elements, and now I'm going to talk about some UI elements inside of bots and how you can manipulate those to really like build a bot interface. So words are obviously like most interfaces are just words, especially conversational interfaces. And again, we talked about building an NLU model. What you're actually doing when you're building an NLU model is you're taking all of those little goals or jobs and you're defining them as intents. Within those intents is the data and how that, what data lives inside of it, what data needs to be there in order to carry out an action or a request. And you're training the model with all the utterances that you can think of. And then you're crafting responses based on the different actions that can take place. That is true of both text interfaces, chatbots, and voice interfaces. But when you write voice interfaces, you really need to pay attention to writing an interface for speaking and listening as opposed to reading. Just like the talk I'm giving right now is very different in delivery and content because I'm talking than it would be if I was giving a blog post. Like that is what you're thinking about when you're writing a voice interface. And we actually just write out scripts and act them out. So I get someone else in my company to play the bot and I play a human, and we actually talk back and forth. Because if it's not natural between two humans, it is not going to be natural between a human and a bot. And for chatbots, you can prototype your chatbots. There's a lot of really great tools to help you like quickly see how interactions are going to flow, and you can even test them with those tools. So BotKit Studio, as Ben was showing, is like a great tool for that, and building them as well, but it can get you into just quickly testing. And ChatFuel is another really good one just for Facebook Messenger. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones that are out there. Motion AI is another one. I'm trying to think of the free ones too to work on prototyping. And also just like, it's pretty impossible to do it through our typical prototyping because there's just so many paths a user can take. But again, trying to just go through all the paths of a conversation is a good idea. You as the designer kind of have to, even though it gets pretty mind-numbing when you've been working on it for a few months. So the words and what they're made of, this is how brand influences the words and what's inside of them. And there's voice, tone, and persona. So voice is like the quality of the words that you're using. Tone is how you modulate that for specific situations. And then the persona is like the character that embodies both the voice and tone. And character could be just like the way your brand expresses itself in conversation. And that could also be like a mascot, an actual character that is built to deliver your brand's message in conversation. And in voice interaction, there's SSML, which is a markup language that lets you inflect some differences in speech in the synthesized speech. So you can change like the prosody, the pitch, the speed, create breaks and pauses so that you can provide like emphasis on certain aspects of synthesized speech. And then we have like all of the chat interface affordances that are inside of a messaging app, and those like text, emoji, images, like there's just so many. Slack has like an infinite combination of them that like is just too many to think of. But really, like you have all of these to help inflect your brand. And so like the actual images are like branded icons and which emojis you're going to use, and the quality of the words. And so here I'm actually showing some structure that helps users navigate a chatbot and actually shows them like what's inside of an entire bot so that they can like both natural language input, like show me the speakers happening at 4 p.m. on Friday. And they can see that versus like, oh, I'm going to go to Friday and browse the entire lineup. And that supports like two modes of interaction, which is like browsing and searching, or like discovery and task completion. So users who like don't really know what they want to do, their mental model is really broad and they're trying to figure it out. Providing structure helps them understand what your bot actually does. And then users are like, I know exactly what this does. I'm going to just type in what I need. You can also support that through natural language input. And then like the overlooked thing that I think designers don't think about quite as much because it's kind of given to us is the media and the hardware that is available just on the device that you're working with. So this is any screens and sensors, lights on the Alexa or the Google Home. And so when I talk to Alexa, she lights up. I know she's listening. While I'm talking, she continually shows me that she's listening. When I stop talking, she has like her little processing light. And then she starts speaking back to me, and I'm both getting like audio output, but she's also has a light for when she's speaking. And they're adding more lights for things like notifications and incoming calls and messages awaiting you. But I can also mute her and she lights up red, so I know that she's muted all the time and not listening to me, and I can see like where the volume is and get like visual feedback. So that is a really important part of the feedback loop. So like there's people who are building hardware every day and they're like, let's put a voice interface in it because this would be really awesome. And they don't think about, well, I have to have room for lights that are going to show people what's going on when it's listening, and how do I mute it? And it's like, oh no, what I thought was just a simple speaker is now going to be like 6 buttons and not 6, 2 buttons and a light. So thinking about those things to have a really good feedback loop between your user and the hardware interface is really important. And if you're building like a software interface that's kind of mimicking this, like look at that Google speech search, voice search, and you'll see like how they mimic all of those things in their software to give that feedback to the user. All right, I hope this was helpful to y'all to understand some of like the baseline things that a conversational UI designer thinks about when they're going to build a chatbot. And I'd love to hear any feedback y'all have. You can hit me up on Twitter at Voxable, send us an email, or just check out our website. Thanks.